So here we're here today to talk about crawling and indexing issues for large websites, and I really appreciate everything that Martin just put forth, because we are going to talk about some of the issues that we've encountered for JavaScript websites. My name is John Morabito. I am the director of SEO at Stellar Rising. So to sort of kick things off, recently Patrick did a presentation where he shared a tweet of mine. So I'm going to share a tweet or a quote from Patrick here. Search engines can't rank what they can't crawl or haven't seen. This is why crawling and indexing are important topics, and I couldn't really agree here more. This, by the way, comes from the Content King Academy piece on crawling and indexing, and I definitely recommend that. So as Patrick said, this is why we need to focus on this. All of our relevance improvements and optimizing page speed and getting links to the website really aren't going to help us if we're not being crawled first, right? So obviously, the process here first involves discovery. Google needs to first find these URLs, and they can do that through either our XML sitemaps, our own internal links from other websites, and then from there, they're going to go ahead and crawl those URLs. And really, Martin just sort of went over all of this, so I'm not going to go too deep in here. But essentially, what my team does with our crawling and indexing audit is essentially look at issues within these three different categories and try to identify where there might be problems for some of our client websites. When we're doing this, one of the things that we're looking at is essentially how many pages. So this question of how many pages is something that we look at from these 5 different data points. We're looking at the number of indexed pages in Google, and when I say that, I mean a site colon query, which isn't exactly reliable all the time. So we also like to look at the Google Search Console number of pages indexed as provided to us by the Search Console index coverage reports. We look at the number of pages that we're actually submitting within our sitemaps. We look at the number of pages that have been indexed on the sitemaps, and then we also look at what we get back from a manual crawl. Looking or comparing the delta between these different areas often sheds light on issues around low quality pages, pages that shouldn't be in the index, pages that maybe have issues with them for one reason or another. And that's usually where we spend our time investigating. All right. So as I just mentioned before, one of the sort of leading reasons you're going to find pages not actually be indexed is often not a technical one, but can often be quality related. And this actually happened, or this tweet came out this morning from Barry that sort of reinforces that idea. So here's a client case example of where we saw low quality pages causing issues with them making their way into the index. So this was a nationwide casting website, and the issue here was related to user profiles, but this could be the same thing for, let's say, property detail pages on a real estate website, faceted search pages on an e-commerce website, or even low quality product pages on a very, very large e-commerce website. So in this particular case, what we identified was looking at the crawled but not indexed category within the Search Console reports. We started to notice a trend that a lot of these pages tended to be these user pages. We looked at the pages from user profiles that had been indexed, and we found that those tended to be more complete. So this seems sort of obvious, but essentially profiles that had what we found to be around an 80% completion rate were those that tended to be indexed, were ones like the one up front for Myra, very little information. That information probably is available on other websites. And so there wasn't really any unique searcher value for those pages. And so in this particular case, we wanted to avoid Google seeing too many low quality pages on our website. We wanted to avoid index bloat. We wanted to avoid sort of crawl budget waste with Google crawling these pages that they eventually determined not to index anyway. And so we made the recommendation that anything with less than 80% completion should be de-indexed, essentially putting the robot's no index tag on the page. Another issue that we come into oftentimes around crawling is pagination or click depth issues. So in this particular case, we actually had a client that sort of combined pagination, discoverability issues, as well as click depth issues, sort of all in one issue, or all in one sort of problem. So the problem here was that the client had a JavaScript reliant, or a user action dependent button makeup for the way that you would get to different pages within a archive page of different property detail pages. So this is a regional real estate brokerage where they had maybe 60,000 individual property listings. Each of these archive pages for a different area goes quite deep with many hundreds, if not thousands, of individual property listings. And the way that the pagination was set up, actually, until a user clicked into the pagination sort of area, those links were not present within the DOM. So Google wasn't actually able to crawl past page one of any of these individual pages. We basically worked with their team to create more of a standard pagination setup where you have multiple links to the subsequent pages directly on that page one. So on page one, let's say we have links to page 2, 3, 4, and 5, which essentially enabled the crawlers to get into these property detail pages at a much lower click depth than they had before. Additionally, it actually enabled the crawlers to get past page one where they previously were completely unable. So in this particular case, we used Screaming Frog and Google Search Console to identify these issues. We, again, worked with their developers to get that new pagination set up. And from there, we saw 50,000 total new pages end up being indexed after we made that change. Spider traps are another thing that we come into when it comes to doing these crawling and indexing audits. In this particular case, we encountered a major beauty brand, actually a series of major beauty brands that had the exact same store finder on their pages. Now, this store finder essentially had a malformed piece of HTML within the AJAX where once crawled, the crawler would then generate a new URL based off that old URL, sort of appending the previous path and then sort of infinitely combining that. The more times it would crawl, the longer the URL would get. And so in this particular case, there's sort of two ways that you can approach a crawl trap. You can either robots.txt out that directory so that the crawlers are unable to go into that directory in the first place. Or you could also use sort of a combination of a no follow on the attribute or on the link pointing into those pages. It depends on if you have the ability to actually implement something like a robots.txt. In the case of Shopify, that's not on your list of things that you can do. And so the no follow might be your only option. If we're talking about a site where you do have control over robots.txt, in many cases, I would probably lean toward the robots.txt declaration for a situation like a crawl trap. So expired and discontinued product pages are another thing that we've come into. Basically, when a e-commerce website is not continually culling their legacy product pages or getting rid of product pages that have become expired and they just sort of show this, sorry, this item is no longer available message, this can have a tendency to increase the number of soft 404s on your site. So eventually Google will see this as a soft 404 as the user can't really take the action that the page was intended for. And so they're going to start basically dropping these. Or if they don't start dropping these, they're going to keep them in the index. And that's problematic from a user perspective. So in this particular client's case, we'd actually done a branded search audit where we were looking at things like brand name plus backpacks and seeing that up to 18 of the top 20 ranking results were their website, but pointed to an out-of-stock product page. It was a 200 status code because they're on a JavaScript framework and they actually have a hard time throwing a true 404. And so these pages just sort of sat around the index. And so we worked with the client to basically ask them for a database pull of any product that existed on their website going back to the beginning of time for this site. We then use Screaming Frog and the API tools to pull in all of the data about those URLs. So did it have any links? Did it ever get any traffic within the last 3 months? Did it have a sizable number of impressions? So maybe it's not getting traffic just yet, but these pages are still hanging out somewhere in the index that they're in visibility positions that are garnering impressions. We then looked at that list and prioritized it based on those metrics and figured out which of these URLs we wanted to set up redirects for, whether it be to an equivalent product or to a category page where that product had come from, or if we wanted to simply serve a 410 status code that basically told Google, hey, these pages are gone, don't come back and crawl them. The thing about a 404 is, luckily, Google is pretty nice to us in some regards when it comes to that, and we'll see that at first as potentially a mistake. The page is not found, but maybe you lost it. Maybe you're over there praying to St. Anthony and that you're going to find it again, and that it comes back 3 days later. And so Google will have the sort of tendency to come back and hit these 404s, not as much as they would a 200 status code page, but they will come back and crawl it. And so if you're looking to really maximize crawl budget, particularly on a very large website, when you're actioning something like a for something status code against 20,000 URLs, I do think it makes sense to use that 410 and explicitly tell them, hey, this page is gone. No need to ever come back and crawl that. Orphan pages. So moving on to some tips and tricks here. Orphan pages is something that we definitely come into in these audits a lot. And essentially a page that is not linked to from your internal site architecture is essentially invisible. Yes, in some cases you might find that still in the index, and you might even still find that garnering some level of impressions. However, I think this is going back to something like Matt Cutt said, is like, if you want a page to rank, you should be linking to it somewhere on your website, right? And an XML sitemap is not a substitution for an appropriate site architecture. And so very often we'll come into a site, we'll say, hey, what are all these pages that are in the XML sitemap? They're indexed, they get a little bit of traffic. What's going on with these? And maybe the developer or the client team will say something like, oh, well, those are pages that we want to have for like marketing purposes or SEO purposes, but we don't want to link to them on the website because we don't want people to see these things. Well, unfortunately, it's really hard for you to sort of have your cake and eat it too in that regard. You need to basically link to those URLs if you want them to be seen as relevant, authoritative, and for Google to trust those. So some of the ways that you can find orphan pages would be if you don't have a crawler, you're going to have a hard time. But if you don't have a crawler, you might be able to amass a list of your own URLs and use your Search Console performance reports and export those. This is definitely for a smaller site, and cross-reference that. In many cases, what we end up doing is using either Screaming Frog or Content King to help identify those orphan pages. Interestingly enough, Content King does something kind of fascinating, which is if you have, let's say, your pagination, and this is something that happened to that major casting website. So if your pagination, let's say on page 2, has a canonical that points back to page 1, this is incorrect. And for better or worse, Content King will actually label pages that it discovers via XML, but not through crawling that pagination, as orphaned. Essentially, the crawler will only follow along canonical path. And that is essentially what Google will most of the time do. Yes, they're going to crawl your non-canonical URLs, but if you think about sort of the canonical pointing to the wrong page, that can ostensibly, or sort of in a certain sense, cause pages to potentially be orphaned by virtue of the fact that if that page is at like 500 or page 500 of a paginated set where page 1 through 499 points back to page 1, the likelihood that Google's going to keep going down that tunnel and hoping that at some point they're going to have a directive to continue getting that information, it's unlikely. So you want to make sure that you are getting your canonicals correct from pagination as to avoid that sort of quasi-orphaned page, if you will. Dealing with faceted search. So faceted search is something that comes up for a lot of our bigger client websites, whether it be a real estate website or an e-commerce website. One of the ways that we can help to sort of deal with or combat the issues around that would be to simply not even have those URLs crawlable. So you can construct your facets in a sort of JavaScript setup wherein those links are not present within the DOM without user interaction, and that innately is going to make it so that Google can't actually crawl that stuff. It works just fine for users, and it sort of offers you the best of all of the different worlds. But in many cases, that type of setup is not possible for our clients. They've already got some type of faceted search. They're using Oracle ATG, they're using Indica or what have you, and that's kind of just the way that their search faceting works. In those cases, we'll often look to employ a combination or one or the other of the nofollow or robots.txt. In many cases, I've struggled with faceted search around the idea that the canonical might be the most appropriate because it enables you to roll up those ranking signals back to let's say the primary category or the main category. However, what I've seen in most of the instances that we've tried that is because Google is really looking for appreciably similar content when it comes to the canonical. We see them tend to ignore a canonical for, let's say, a category page that once had 200 product pages and starts with product A, B, C, and then a filtered version of that same page that now has, instead of 200 products, just 3, and those products are Z, X, Y. When Google looks at these two pages, they're really not appreciably similar enough that the canonical seems appropriate. And it's almost like when we maybe put the canonical on the wrong page and Google selects their own canonical. So in that sense, while we might have the desire to try to roll up all of the equity that we could get from these faceted search pages, in our experience, even with very, very big brands that have huge numbers of links coming into the website, we very seldom see people linking directly to a faceted search page. So in that sense, I feel very comfortable often recommending some combination of robots.txt or perhaps nofollow, those no index follow, which over time eventually becomes no index, no follow anyway. But I really tend to not worry about equity passing through our faceted search pages for our clients, at least based on the data I see in our sort of link analysis of the clients that we have. XML sitemaps are something that we could, so, I think throwing out some tips here, many of us are familiar with trying to limit things to around 50,000 or less than 50,000 URLs or 50 megabytes for our XMLs. Breaking your XMLs into groupings by page type is something that if you're using Yoast or often many CMS platforms kind of automatically do this for you. But I would say the bigger your website, the more essential this becomes. And we have at times gotten very granular with our setup of XML sitemaps where we have an index that has maybe 50 different XMLs in it. And within that, we can get really good understanding of indexing. Furthermore, at times we can prove out theories that we might have. So in the case of a real estate website, we might have a theory that property detail pages past a click depth of 10 are tending to have difficulty finding their way into the index within a reasonable amount of time. And so we might identify 2,000 URLs or 5,000 URLs that exist past click depth of 10, put those into a special XML sitemap that's our 10 and plus click depths, and then have another XML that's exclusively URLs that exist higher within our site architecture. And through submitting these two sitemaps, we can actually get data back about which sort of setup is actually being indexed. If we see predominantly those pages past click depth of 10 are being submitted but not indexed, there could be other issues, right? There could be quality issues, but it does seem as though that would prove to our theory being correct, particularly if those 10 and above or 10 or lower tended to be indexed with no problem or had a larger likelihood of being indexed. Another cool thing about XML sitemaps, and I think this is just such a cool tip, it really doesn't have too much to do with what I'm talking about today, but if you, for whatever reason, don't have access to an XML sitemap, or I'm sorry, access to Google Search Console, or worse, your client can't create an XML sitemap and they also don't have access to Google Search Console, you can't create it. You could theoretically create your own XML sitemap, spin it up with Screaming Frog, put it up on your own website with URLs for someone else's website through basically verifying and submit that to Google. Or you could submit your own URLs to Google within an XML that is just sort of pinging Google of these URLs. So I thought that was something that's cool. Really, as I mentioned earlier, this audit that we do for our clients, our crawling and indexing audit, is largely centered around looking at that delta of pages and then trying to look at different coverage reports to get a better understanding of what's going on with those deltas. Why do we not have the right number of pages in these different buckets? And so my favorite coverage reports, the ones that I tend to get the most information out of, the ones where as soon as I look at a client's website, I go to these reports to get a sense of what's going on, would be crawled but not indexed. And these are often URLs that have, going back to Barry's comment, these are often the URLs that have some type of quality issue. Could be pagination, could be duplication, could be something where they're just not good search material, right? Google doesn't want these pages for one reason or another. More often than not, it is related to those types of matters, less so than something technical. In our experience, the technical things tend to be things like the discovered but not indexed. So this is where maybe Googlebot has discovered a URL through their crawling of another URL, and they're parsing out of all of the URLs on that page. But for one reason or another, system resources are not available. That URL ends up in the queue, but does not get crawled. This could be because other URLs on their list have a higher priority, have a higher crawl priority. Or it could be because, or related to the fact that they're getting kind of bogged down in crawling through your website. Going back to some of the stuff Martin was talking about, maybe your JavaScript, in order for them to actually parse out these URLs, they have to execute your JavaScript. And in order to execute your JavaScript, on every page load, they're acting basically as a stateless crawler, and it takes 20 seconds for them to load your JavaScript application. Well, they're not going to crawl through as many pages on your website as if you had a 0.2 second time to first byte and an average load time of 2 seconds on your pages. One of these two scenarios is going to have more of their pages crawled. And so where, let's say you're a real estate website, or let's say you're this casting website, and things are constantly moving on your website. Well, as you're putting up new stuff on the website, Google might be able to discover these URLs, but there just isn't quite enough juice in the tank for them to actually go crawl them, render them, and put them into the index. And so this is where things like making sure that you're paying attention to page speed from sort of more of a holistic level become important, right? We've recently heard from Gary that, or we're reminded of Gary's statement via Barry, that page speed is not a massive ranking factor. But when we start to talk about page speed that slows down Google's ability to actually get to the end of your website or get through any meaningful number of pages on your website, this becomes a much higher priority task. And then index but not discovered through XML. So it's like, what are these even doing in there? Google has, for one reason or another, decided to index these. So these are either things that have unique user value, and Google has elected to include them in their index, which has significant meaning, and they really ought to be included within our XML, or in many cases, they ought to be included within our XML. Or conversely, these are maybe lower quality pages that are not included within our XML. For some reason, they have made their way into the index, probably by virtue of our own internal linking or external linking to these pages, or maybe more seldom that. But either way, these are things that we have to consider. Do we even want Google to be regularly crawling these pages? If we have not consciously elected that these are part of the website that we want to feed to Google, then why are they there? In many cases, you might find that there's an appropriate reason for them to be there. They're not important enough for you to say, hey, Google, here is something of unique search or value. I want you to come index this, but they're also not garbage enough for you to say, I need to get rid of these. That can be a possibility too. But either way, sort of going back to the point of the slide, you could spend infinite amounts of time, if you have enough URLs, in these three reports, and really make some serious progress in improving the way that Google is crawling and subsequently indexing the pages on your website. My last sort of tip here before we wrap up and head to questions would be Search Console setup. So if you have a lot of pages and you want to look, and there it is, I forgot to undo my, my notifications. Dan, you tried to warn me, man. So if we have these pages, sorry, of course, it threw me off too. So if we submit our site maps, or I'm sorry, if we submit our site through different levels of Google Search Console, we have multiple different Search Console setups for different folders or parent directories within our site. What this can have the effect of doing is essentially enabling us to get better data about our coverage report. So we can go deeper within the coverage reports through understanding that without having the cutoff limit of 1,000 URLs. So let's say you've got 1,000 products in your shop. You know, that is something where you can get that full list of URLs through the shop. So, so that's my Search Console tip there. We'll definitely open up for questions now. Again, my name's John Morabito. I'm the Director of SEO at Stellar Rising. You can find me through emailing me there or head over to stellarrising.com. And I'm also on Twitter at John Morabito SEO.